Thanks for being with Morning Live, 20 minutes before 7. Now, the African National Congress concluded its National Executive Committee meeting last night. By no means the only topic, but certainly the most contentious issue was, of course, the step-aside resolution. And it stipulates that all members who have been charged with corruption or other serious crimes must step aside within 30 days, failing which they should be suspended. Now, to discuss this and other issues addressed in that ANC NEC meeting and broader permutations, we're joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, good morning. Thanks for speaking to us.
Good morning, Zakina, and it's lovely having been back on the show with you and Leanne.
So here we have a situation, a long time in the making. There's been a lot of to and froing around this particular conference resolution. One would imagine for obvious reasons, but let's try and unpack it. What do you make of how the ANC has finally come to put some stipulation to the step-aside rule?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very controversial. It's been one of those resolutions that, as much as the ANC had decided on that in Nasrec in 2017, it was a resolution that those that were implicated under some kind of charges just didn't want to go away. They just completely basically pulled back, and they said, we will fight this rule and we won't adhere to the rule. And I think the interesting thing about this was that there was even a discussion that Ace Magashule had said that if the rule had to be applied, he's not going to go anywhere. He's going to go back to the provinces and the branches to make that decision. Now, that's quite an interesting thing to say, because the branches and the provinces have already made that decision in terms of what they went to and decided on and basically agreed on in Nasrec. What this tells you is that this rule sets into motion a very unprecedented way in which things have to have evolved in the party. But more than that, it tells you how high the stakes are and how particular individuals and particular groupings just don't want this rule to come into play, because then they see this rule as marginalizing their space. But I think what the president had announced yesterday evening as the final statement, as the outcome of the meeting, was quite interesting, because in the run-up to this, apart from the fact that there was speculation and all kinds of reports about that rule becoming the key factor or driver in the chaos that descended in the party on Sunday evening, I think there was also the question of how that rule may have been watered down to a certain extent. I know that there were some reports suggesting that it was a 7-day period in which implicated individuals would have to either step aside or then be forced into suspension. Now we see it's a 30-day period in which that has to happen. And it's very, very interesting to ask the question, why 30 days? What is the process that still needs to be consulted? And I think if I understood the statement correctly, it was also about putting into place implementation processes in terms of preparing for the person to step aside. What does that mean? Does that person go? Is it some kind of process where the person still remains but doesn't really get involved in the daily activities, etc., of the party? But I think when it comes to the SG, it is a much more deeper question. It's a much more important issue and strategic issue, because the office of the SG is quite important in terms of its relationship between branches and the center, relationship with constituencies, and this then means that if he steps aside, Jesse Duarte is going to be a kind of interim successor. Again, consulting with past leaders or elders, as I think the statement was. I don't know who those are. Maybe it was individuals that they will come together and advise the SG about what needs to be done, or what other people would have to be advised in terms of what needs to be done. But again, it's a statement that gives us a little bit of hope, particularly in that line around the step-aside rule. But I think the nuts and bolts still need to be unpacked, and basically we're not sure what that is.
So here you have a specific emphasis on the fact that this 30-day period will be to enable the implementation and not the review of a decision. And this was specifically highlighted, Sanusha. Can we talk to why it's important to unpack and understand that? And also, as you ask about who then, in terms of consultation, this will be devolved to, given that you already have an integrity commission that seems to have been obliterated for all intents and purposes. But also, this is not only about the person of the Secretary General of the ANC. He's not the only one, although there seems to have been an inordinate focus on Ace Magashule, given his high profile within the party. There are many members of the African National Congress who will be affected by this.
Indeed, Sakina, and I think the last point you make is very, very important to contextualize the issue of what the step-aside rule means in the run-up to NASREC as well. So there are many other individuals who are members of the ANC who may actually even hold particular offices in government, but even at the provincial and local government level, and whom have to probably also then think about how this applies to them. What's very, very important to contextualize as well is that when you start applying these kinds of mechanisms in terms of how to deal with individuals who are under a cloud of controversy or have criminal charges instituted against them, it then becomes a precedent. And then, of course, the other angle to that is the precedent is not just applied to one set of factions, one set of individuals, but it has to be applied uniformly across the organization. And it comes back to the earlier point you asked me, what does this mean for the ANC? What it does mean for the ANC, I think, if you really want to be strict in the way that you apply the rule and the step-aside rule and the implementation process within the 30 days, is that you may end up in a situation where there'll be harder challenges and more difficulties, where there'll be internal dynamics where it's possibly, and it's already happened, where it becomes even more acute about who steps aside. So suddenly you're going to end up with more factionalism about the rule itself, which has already happened, but you're going to end up with more tension, more fights, more kind of these very, very acute kinds of fault lines where others are going to say, well, I'm stepping aside, you need to step aside, you need to do that. At the end of the day, I'm wondering, how much will be left of the party in terms of personnel if you're going to apply this rule. And then the last point to make as well is that it's the SG. So it's all about the SG, but I think you're right in the sense where you say that it's much more and much more broader than the SG.
So also looking at the RET forces, and again, emphatic was the president in that statement about the RET forces and not having a space within the organization, as it were, going forward. So let's talk to that. Again, as you say, this will probably lead to even greater factional battles within the party, because we know those who are aligned to the so-called RET forces within the party. And of course, this speaks to the balance of forces within not only the NEC, but within the broader party itself.
Yeah, I found that the specific reference to the RET faction in the party was quite interesting for me. Although the president did also mention other organizational structures or other organizational entities linked to the contest, Sizwe, Stream, and so forth. But I thought the specific reference to the RET was quite interesting in the sense that he was calling them out, that you cannot actually now organize any activities. And I think he is also trying to say that you won't be able to align in a way that you've previously aligned to the RET. And for me, I see this as just opening up another Pandora's box in many ways. It's going to be unleashing some kind of pushback. And in particular, in the next 30 days, however that implementation process goes, and whether or not others will accept the implementation process and not necessarily of just reviewing the decision, I think it's going to be even more intense than previously. And so the RET may find themselves with their back against the wall, but it's not necessarily that they're going to go anywhere slowly or they're going to go anywhere fast. They're going to be there. They're not going to basically give up what they feel is their particular kind of structure, their leverage, their kind of ground within the party and outside of the party. So I think we've got to watch that and see to what extent if there's a violation of that decision about the RET, what would be then the next steps for the party, and what does this mean for those that are aligned to the RET? Is this one way in which we just see the president and the pro-reformers in the party saying, we need to stop this now, we need to basically just essentially get rid of this, or just trying to make sure that this faction doesn't become overhauling and overpowering? But I think it's not going to be that easy, because again, these are very intense battles, the stakes are high, and they are people have very, very vested interests around why they are linked to these different factions and institutions within the party.
So speaking of going into this NEC meeting over the weekend, there were reports and apparently, depending on who you're listening to, there are rumors as well that the issue of the president's proximity to white monopoly capital and Johan Rupert in particular was an issue that came up. So the narrative would seem that the president is under pressure to actually get rid of the SG. So let's talk about that in terms of the balance of forces within the party and, of course, proximity to power from all sides. Where does this leave the president of the African National Congress and, by extension, the president of the country, given what's happening and what's playing out now?
As I've been reading and just getting a sense of what these issues are, particularly around succumbing or the president aligning or giving in to white monopoly capital as a narrative. It seemed to be quite the rage over the weekend. It kind of just got more and more traction in terms of the pushback against the president, and that he's not really listening, or he's not really aligning to what the balance of forces are within the party. But more importantly, it's a narrative that plays out very, very importantly within the social spaces of South Africa, within different pockets of society, where the narrative becomes one where the president is seen as being more in alignment with the white monopoly capital or the Stellenbosch group or Rupert, and so forth. And so what you really have is this kind of narrative that becomes part of a way in which the pushback takes place. What does this mean for the president going forward? I mean, I think to a large extent, he has been dealing with this for a long time. There was always those salvos that were shot about the fact that he represents a particular constituency in the party, and he represents a particular constituency in the South African landscape. And of course, every now and then, you would have both forces in the party, but also actors outside of the party who would come out and make these claims and basically call him out on it. So I think he's dealing with that in the way that he's always dealt with it. He's taken it on, he's used it as a basis to not allow it to become something that impacts on him. But I think going forward, it will be important to ask the question how this traction and this narrative now, with what the president and the NEC have decided with regard to the RET and their activities in the party and outside of the party, how that will then become an even more important tool for them to use in order to discredit the president and place some kind of brand risk on his image and his reputation. So I think to me, it's not necessarily about only what does this mean for the president, but what does this mean for those that are now on that side of particular areas where they are against the RET, and the RET now says, right, it's all or nothing. And it can play out very, very badly in society as well, because you can then end up with situations where the narrative is really not about the fact that socio-economic transformation has not taken place, and we're still having questions around economic marginalization and so forth, and ownership of the economy, but it plays out in a much more parochial way, which I think we have to monitor.
And just finally, to that score, the whole question around the president and campaign funding. How important an issue does that become moving forward in the ANC?
I think two ways, Sakina. The first one is for the party itself. And what we see now as the legislation around political party funding. What does this mean for the ANC in terms of how it derives its sources of funding, both from the state, but also from the fact that provinces kind of pay the ANC in terms of in election year for getting themselves into the space. And I think that stream of funding is going to be heavily reduced. And so it's going to create issues for the party in terms of how they go about structuring their funding in terms of the Political Party Funding Act. I think for the president, the question would also be whether or not this whole CR17 issue goes away or for once and for all is decided upon, and there is some kind of a decision made about it. Unfortunately, I don't think it goes away. I think it remains a kind of circle around him, particularly in terms of how the dynamics of NASREC played out, and more importantly, what the implications of that are. And I think you also have an actor that is in the space that is not necessarily within the party, but very much a strategic voice of the party or of particular issues that is happening in the party, and I'm talking here of the EFF, and that's not going to go away any soon with that tension there. So I think it remains part of the landscape, it remains part of the way in which the ANC's funding will also be under scrutiny, but for incoming individuals who want to contest, etc., I think they have to watch these spaces and think about the precedent and think about the implications this has for them. And then finally, we also may have to think about the idea that there will be private funders that can fund the ANC and fund political parties. But then again, the question is, how do you deal with transparency of who are these funders and what the intention is for funding?
Thank you so much, political analyst Sanusha Naidu, for helping us analyze the latest developments regarding the extended ANC NEC meeting, which ended yesterday evening. So we're going to take a quick break.